Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us to our latest session in our series Lives of the Left. Apologies for slight mix-up.
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you very much for joining us in terms of Mark Wadsworth, who's joining us next week, next Thursday. But today we're very happy to be joined by Ben Lewis, who has prepared a talk on Clara Zetkin, German communist who joined the Spartacist League and all sorts of other groups she's been involved in. Ben is an expert on social democracy in Germany during that period in the early 19th century, 20th century.
20th century, late 90s.
And he's doing a great job translating documents from that period, newspapers, etc. So if you can support his work, it's very valuable work. We'll put the link in the chat on Patreon. Would be much appreciated. So Ben, you've got some slides as well, haven't you?
I do. If I share screen.
Yep, I'll get out of
that should work. Is that okay?
Yep, can see it. Great.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Tina. Hello, everyone. I can't see you, but hi. My name is Ben Lewis, and as Tina said, I've been working on German social democracy for a long time now, maybe over a decade. But in the recent past, I've had the fortune of and the luck, I suppose, of working on or beginning a longer project on Clara Zetkin and her life and work, concretely in relation to her editorship of a magazine called Die Gleichheit, Equality, which we'll look at briefly later on. But what follows here is just a kind of intro, a beginner's guide to Clara Zetkin, as it were. And hopefully there'll be room if you have questions, pointers to start the discussion with them. Please, we can do that in later on. So I'm not going to go into huge detail. She is, as Tina alluded to, her life is a long one that spans some incredibly important decades in the history of the workers' movement and indeed in the history of Europe and the world, actually. But I would like to make the point at the start that we are dealing with perhaps one of the most controversial figures in 20th century history for a number of reasons that we'll get into later on. So she's been either kind of embraced as this kind of Stalinist superwoman, or on the other hand, dismissed as a kind of dogmatic anti-feminist communist, and being described as a witch by all sorts of various people that we'll return to later on. So we're dealing with someone who's an incredibly controversial figure today, and indeed was an incredibly controversial figure in her time, and the two cannot be separated. So I put 1957, so I did this rather quickly. 1857 to 1933, not 1957 to 1933. And we're going to look basically today at 5 or 6 chapters, I think, of her life. Childhood, the young Marxist, the party soldier and pioneer of the International Socialist Women's Movement, an opponent of war and social peace, the trials and tribulations of a communist MP, a tragedy of her own making, Zetkin and Stalinism, and One Last Stand, the opening speech as oldest member of the Reichstag in 1932. And then, as I say, I'll touch briefly upon some of the controversies that surround her name still today, and perhaps we can look at those in the discussion or not, and you can field any questions you have. Like I say, I will be going through quite a lot of material here relatively quickly. So her childhood is interesting in terms of the milieu into which she's born. It's against the backdrop of a rapidly industrializing Germany, particularly in Eastern Germany, Saxony, where she's born into a little village called Wiederau, just outside of Leipzig. And her father is a Protestant teacher. Her mother is an influential feminist of quite high standing. She kind of married a little bit below her station, we might say today. But Zetkin is basically from a well-to-do family. In essence, her father doesn't earn a lot as a teacher, but she describes him as a Christian of a kind of Tolstoyan persuasion. So he's very beset by the idea that one must do something for the greater good. And indeed, he doesn't earn much as a teacher, but he's very committed to the local community and the kids and everything. And Zetkin is interesting in that she grows up with the influence of her mother, who was, as I say, strongly influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution and indeed the 1848 revolutions, when we start to see the first, what Zetkin would later describe as bourgeois feminist movements and associations in Germany, critically the the General Association of German Women, in which her mother played a part, and she describes her household as a kind of hothouse, a kind of debating house, really, between her Protestant father and her feminist mother. While they saw many things in similar ways, they disagreed, for example, on the role of religion. And you can see how throughout her life, this influence of kind of Tolstoy and Christianity, the emphasis on Bildung, which means kind of education, but in the more rounded sense of the term, one's development, one's flowering as an individual, one's blossoming, is a key trope in her life and in her political activity, as we'll see. Basically, then she goes on to train to become a teacher in foreign languages. Foreign languages are one of the things that A, keep her alive in her early days, but then B, establish her really as a leading figure in the international movement. She's fluent in English, French, Italian, obviously German, and a little bit of Russian as well. And that obviously puts her in good standing later on in her career path as a revolutionary. She trains to become a teacher in one of the few German schools at the time where women can achieve a full Abschluss, a full kind of completion of their school education, and she does so under the influence of another very important figure in the history of the women's movement in Germany, August Schmidt, who is a leading writer, speech maker, organizer for the women's movement. She later falls out with Schmidt, but always holds her in high regard for her achievements. They go different ways. I think when she eventually joins what was then the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, she says, why are you associating with that criminal rabble, I think is Schmidt's way of putting it. So, there was no love lost between the so-called bourgeois women's movement and then what became the social democracy. And I just got a few pictures here just to show, and she describes this in a book that came out in the 1920s, which was based on interviews with her memoirs from her life in 1926, published by the KPD. And she says, I still remember the seeing the poverty in the place where she grew up, and the fact that women's role, partly as her mother was making out and constantly emphasizing to her, was changing rapidly as a result of industrialization, capitalist social relations, etc. And yeah, eventually they resettle in nearby Leipzig, which is the cradle of the German workers' movement in Engels' words. So we move on to initial Marxism, a contact with the left. To say she joins the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. She's influenced by the writings of Lassalle and indeed Russian populism. So she has a number of friends in the Russian populist movement, students that are influenced by the Narodniki movement, and they live in and around Leipzig. She gets to know some of their ways, their ways of looking at the world, their revolutionary kind of practices, which are sometimes like overly romantic. And I think as a young woman, she's kind of attracted to that. This kind of, at one point she says, I swear that I will give my life to the cause of the proletarian revolution and things like that. So but then through the mediation of her brother, her sister, she never actually fell out. She fell out with and lost all contact with altogether, never really spoke to her again. But with her brother, who is also a teacher, she comes into contact with the writings of Lassalle and also the German socialist press, such as it was at the time. She also meets the man whose name she takes. They don't get married. I think partly because she wanted to retain her German citizenship, but she marries Ossip. She meets her life partner Ossip Zetkin, who was another Russian emigre working in Germany, but he was far more influenced by what was known as the Marxist wing of the German movement at the time, and he kind of then introduces her and kind of brings her away from the populist circle. And at one point she goes to her populist friend and says, look, I'm a social democrat now, you either come with me or I'm gone. And she had to leave, and that was but again, it marks a milestone in her development. She joins the socialist movement in Germany in a sense right at the worst possible time, because as she's signing her book, again, it's unclear whether that actually took place because of the role of women in Germany at the time. But she basically becomes a member of the organization, and it's banned immediately. All socialist agitation is banned, and they're known as the Bismarck's anti-socialist laws, 1878 till 1890. And Ossip, after they're having a birthday party, which was often a a kind of euphemism for a socialist party meeting at the time in illegality. And during this birthday party at which August Bebel was speaking, several of them are arrested by the police, including Ossip, and he is forced out of the country as an unwanted alien, I think is how you put it, an unwanted migrant. She decides she doesn't have to, but she joins him in France, where they live together. So say she takes her name. She was born Clara Eisner, becomes Clara Zetkin, and it's there really where she cuts her teeth as a socialist. Before that, she tries her luck at kind of working as a sort of au pair to well-to-do families in Austria and Zurich. And it's in Zurich during this period as well, before she actually joins Ossip in France, I should have mentioned this, that she comes into contact with the kind of core leadership of the Marxist wing of social democracy at the time. So she meets people like Edward Bernstein, who obviously has a bad name later on for what he becomes, but he was really the leading figure and theoretician of the socialist movement at that time. She meets Bebel, she meets Wilhelm Liebknecht, and works with them closely. She's also involved, her kind of first practical tasks, and a very important practical task is her involvement in smuggling the party newspaper, Der Sozialdemokrat, out of Zurich through the passenger trains with luggage, kind of disguised as luggage on passenger trains into Germany. And that was under the tutelage of a guy called Julius Mottler, who was also a strong advocate of women's rights in the socialist movement and in society more generally. He was known as the Red Post, the postal master, because he was basically oversaw this huge illegal operation whereby, despite the laws, it was possible to get the paper printed in Switzerland and then slug it through into Germany illegally. And that's kind of where she used her first, where she came into contact with the left there, which was based in the left leadership, which was based in exile in Zurich, largely, apart from the parliamentarians. France, she's, again, I've mentioned her language skills. She is fundamental then, after meeting Liebknecht and others, to establishing the first Congress of the Second International in Paris. She's involved in the translation of the documents, the preparatory materials, the letters of invitation, etc., etc. And she acts as a translator on the day. And it's here that while she's been living in France, she's been writing various articles with Ossip to kind of earn a living and translating things. She translates Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, for example, from English into German. So they've been kind of struggling away in Paris, trying to make a living and organizing the French left, meeting with comrades and organizing demonstrations, etc. But it's with the founding of the Second International in 1889 that she gives this speech for the liberation of women, which is available in English. You can get that, which basically marks, I would argue, a milestone in the Marxist theory of the liberation of women. It builds upon ideas of those thinkers such as Friedrich Engels and August Bebel, but it's the first kind of, I think, short summary of why it's important for women, it's essential for women to be organized in the workers' movement and indeed within the Social Democratic Party, because without kind of taking too much of a leap to the side, there was a view, particularly under the Stalin influenced socialists at the time, that women were a kind of what they refer to as a dirty competition for male workers that would undercut male wages, etc. It was a kind of narrow, kind of almost guild, not even trade union, but kind of guild type outlook. And Zetkin and others worked very hard to undercut that with a different Marxist approach. Leaping forward slightly now, going from 1891 to 1914, Ossip, her life partner, dies in the late 1880s of tuberculosis, TB. She also had early onset signs of that and had to return to Germany to recuperate, etc. And without going into too much of it, her health was always a real a burden on her. She struggled with her health from actually a relatively young age and went fully blind later on, etc. And that was always something that caused her a lot of problems. But despite that, she still got a hell of a lot done. In 1891, she, following the fall of the anti-socialist law, she returns to Germany with her two sons, Kostya and Maxim. and she decides to settle in Stuttgart. Stuttgart is important in a number of reasons, because it was one of the few German states at that time, before 1908, where women were legally allowed to join political organizations openly. It wasn't the case in Prussia and other places, for example, but in Württemberg you could. And it was also for that reason, for related reasons, it was the kind of focal point of some of the major theoretical journals of the social democracy. So Karl Kautsky, as a foreigner, as an Austrian, lived in the more relaxed surroundings, political environment of slightly more relaxed surroundings of Stuttgart, and there he edited Die Neue Zeit, the weekly theoretical of the SPD. And it was agreed that Zetkin would edit a fortnightly publication for women, specifically for agitation and training of women socialists. And it's called Die Gleichheit, Equality, a magazine for the longer title is for the interests of working women. And she took that publication through, in the face of much criticism, which we can go into. I've done a talk, I can do the YouTube thing, did a talk, much longer talk on this not so long ago about the Die Gleichheit and what it was about. But she took that paper essentially from a circulation of 4,000 in 1902. I think it was the first time it actually made any money. It was bankrolled by a guy called Dietz. You can still see the Dietz publishers today, and it took it up to 124,000 people in 1914, obviously an important date because it's the outbreak of the First World War. Franz Mehring, the German leftist and historian, describes Die Gleichheit as a kind of Clara Zetkin's testament. It's a kind of testament to her brilliance as a writer, as an organizer, as a journalist, as a theoretician. And what's really, I think, one of the things, as I started working on this, one of the most important things that struck me, maybe it's just a reflection of my life situation at the moment, but they arranged for specific supplements within that newspaper for women and housewives, as they put it at the time, but also for children. And I've done an article, again, I can put it in the chat later on what Die Gleichheit at the time was expecting young German children to read, and it's incredible. I mean, just the level of it. You've got Goethe, Sturm, all the classics. And again, we see that reflection. I alluded to it earlier on, a reflection of the fact that Zetkin places enormous emphasis on education, empowerment, thinking, reading, understanding. And as I made a joke to one of my colleagues, most German undergraduates would struggle with undergraduate students of German would struggle with an issue of Die Gleichheit für die Kinder, let alone the children today. So it's actually a really nice piece of our history, and it is without a doubt the first socialist publication for children, which is remarkable. Just again, this is a huge topic, but just some quick themes: women's suffrage, working conditions, the role of women in the party, the changing organizational focus of women in the party, which we can maybe discuss in later on, role of education, colonialism, war, and youth organization. Zetkin, as I've described on various occasions, was a kind of an advocate of a clean break between the bourgeois women's movement and the proletarian women's movement, which is basically her legacy. The idea that the working women require their own movement under capitalism because they are subject to a specific position within that society, and actually they share a lot in common with the working men. And it's the task of the Socialist Party to bring women into the workforce, to organize them within the workforce, and to organize them alongside working class men to achieve liberation. And that was something that she stuck by through the course of her life. It's something that she kind of developed theoretically in all sorts of ways that we can't go into now. And it's something that we must also say was met with certain resistance, certainly in the early days, and even later on into the history of the SPD. People getting up and say, well, if this is liberated women, imagine what's going to come when we get to socialism. Kind of very offhand, sexist remarks reflective of the atmosphere of the time. So it's Zetkin's great merit, in a sense, that she fought against that prevailing atmosphere to develop these radical politics. It should also be said that Die Gleichheit was not just a so-called women's journal. It did not just focus on so-called women's issues, but it was really a mouthpiece of the left wing of the SPD, the revolutionary wing, and particularly its anti-imperialist ideas, which are important. I don't have much time to go into her role as secretary of the International Socialist Women's Movement, but again, this is worth highlighting. Die Gleichheit, the publication, was actually the official, as they put it at the time, the official organ, the official publication of this movement, which encompassed women from all around Europe, North America in particular, but also in smaller pockets beyond. Down in the bottom left there, my bottom left at least, you can see the founding Congress of the International Socialist Women's Movement in 1907. And in the bottom right, you can see a International Women's Day celebration from, I think, 1912. And again, into what we know as International Women's Day today looks a lot different, of course, but the people behind that, the women behind that, were Zetkin and her comrades in the International Socialist Women's Movement. And there's some other pictures there that's in the top right here with Kollontai and others later on. But I thought just provide some images. And then you see in the bottom middle there, a picture of striking women textile workers, particularly in the textile industry. Women had a strong organization, and Zetkin and others were quite keen on developing that. Okay, moving forward, fast forward quite a few years now, we come to the First World War. And as I've alluded to, Zetkin was a member of the revolutionary wing of social democracy. She pulled no punches in criticizing the party leadership, in criticizing party Reichstag deputies, parliamentarians, etc. She became friends with very good friends with Rosa Luxemburg, for example. They were kind of both heading up alongside Kautsky and others the struggle against revisionism in the party in the turn of the century. And one of her main focuses in the journal, as I said, was the question of colonialism, imperialism, and war. So when war breaks out in 1914, and when it turns out that despite all of the resolutions that had been passed, despite the promises that had been made by the Social Democrats and their leadership, they vote for war credits on August the 4th, 1914. Zetkin's initial reaction is say, I thought I would have to go mad or kill myself. Again, such was the shock. And Zetkin is unique in a sense of when it comes to the anti-war opposition within the SPD, because unlike Luxemburg, unlike Liebknecht and Mehring and others, she actually edits and controls a publication that is, as you saw before, has a huge circulation in Germany, is also read beyond, is the official publication of the International Women's Movement. And she's able to use this despite the difficulties that the war imposes on her. She's able to use her publication as a mouthpiece for the left in opposing not just the war, but the policies of so-called social peace, which is the contract, if you like, that's agreed between the workers' movement and the government, the war-waging governments of the various European countries. So that's, as I say, that's the incredibly important chapter in the struggle against the First World War, in the fight to uphold the principles that had been betrayed by the leaders of the Second International. But there are problems. You can see in the picture there, these white gaps, these white chunks. That is actually the mark of the censor. So this is I think this is the first edition after the outbreak. It came out just before the outbreak of World War I, and the censor gets to look at everything and marks everything out. And initially, Zetkin went along with it and tried to kind of play the game and change passages, but in the end, she just said, "No, this is unacceptable. I'm just going to print it with the white gaps." And she says these gaps, these chunks of the text, they speak their own language. And it's through her connections in the International Socialist Women's Movement in particular that Zetkin is then able to organize what is the first meeting of anti-war socialists on both sides of the war, on both sides of the conflict, in Bern, Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, in March 1915. She's then thereafter arrested in Germany for distributing the declaration that was agreed on Bern. Again, I've translated that. It's up on my website. I can put links in the chat later if anyone wants them. She's arrested for a while, and then she's released again in exchange for quite a bit of money, but also because the prosecution realized that she's actually too ill to be in jail. As I said, her ailing health was always an issue for her. In 1916, she joins the Spartacus League alongside Liebknecht and Luxembourg. That'll be familiar to most of you, hopefully. But again, if there's any questions on any of this, just please let me know. And eventually, when it comes to the foundation, again, a bigger topic, but when it comes to the foundation of the USPD, the so-called Independent Social Democrats, which is the basis of which is a parliamentary fraction of MPs who eventually, in 1917, formed their own parliamentary group because they refused to continue voting for war credits. She joined that formation alongside other leading Spartacist members. Thereupon, she is removed. The keys are taken away from her from Die Gleichheit, and she's not allowed to edit that publication anymore. That's also true of a number of other publications at the time, including Kautsky's Die Neue Zeit. He is removed as editor of that. Again, had worked on it like Zetkin for over 25 years. And it's with the foundation of the USPD. Again, I wrote a book on this, how the USPD relates to the foundation of the new KPD, the German Communist Party, in 1919, 1920. And long story short of it is that while Zetkin is critical of the idea to launch the party immediately as a split from the USPD, she is nonetheless obviously in favor of a German Communist Party, thinks that the Russian Revolution, which I probably should have mentioned in slightly more detail, shows the way to overcome the trials and tribulations of war and the shortages, etc., to stop war, to end the First World War. That's what should happen. And then indeed we have the German Revolution in November 1918, in which she takes part, although again largely remotely because of her health. And she joins the German Communist Party against the backdrop of this, and is elected as a communist MP. And you can see here three different things. So there's a electoral poster from the KPD. It says think of Liebknecht, vote for the communist, Spartacus in brackets, the Zetkin list. So again, the list of candidates, Zetkin at the top. She's a very prominent, well-known figure. Die Kommunistin, which was the publication of the KPD for women. It means the female communists. And then here in the bottom right with Agnes Loris and Mathilde Worm, some of the first women to be elected to the German Reichstag. She's a member of the KPD, obviously in the middle. Zetkin to the left is a member of the SPD, and to the right a member of the USPD. So they would sometimes go into parliament together. She's waving her umbrella. And this is probably, for reasons we might get into at the end of this talk, this is probably the least research period of her life. And we will hopefully see why in a second. But basically, with her entrance into the German Communist Party, she, as I said, expresses her affiliation to the Russian Revolution, to Moscow, to the Communist International, as it becomes, as kind of what she sees as the embodiment of true revolutionary internationalism, the kind of which was spoken about in the Second International, but was not achieved. And I've already alluded to the fact that she edited the newspaper for women. She also led the Communist Women's Movement, which grew out of those networks that I discussed earlier in the International Socialist Women's Movement against the war. Did incredible work, on all sorts of issues. And there's a great book coming out soon by Mike Tabor, and a Russian historian, whose name I currently forget, sorry. They put together the resolutions and the protocols of these meetings, the early Communist Women's International. Incredible stuff that many of us will have never even seen or heard of because it's been in the archives in different languages. So that's something to look forward to. And she's an MP really for this entire period up until her death in 1933. She's an MP for the German Reichstag. She moves back and forward between Germany and Moscow, where she's looked after by close family members, her son's wife, etc. Because again, her health is not great. But it's during this time as well that she comes into conflict with certain aspects of the Comintern, the Communist International's politics. These are huge issues to be talking about, but I'll just mention two that are coming to light. The first is the so-called March Action. Again, I've done a talk on that somewhere. I can link the March Action in Germany, which is an attempt really by the Communist Party to forced the question of revolution artificially, almost from a minority position, which he's incredibly critical of. There's a huge debate, fallout at the Third Congress of the Comintern over this question, both between the Germans and the Russians, but also within the Russian delegation, within the German delegation. Lenin and Zetkin come to a kind of compromise which says, look, we broadly agree with your criticism of this. It was wrong, but we need to keep things together. And she kind of goes along with that, but it causes all sorts of political problems for her at home with former allies, not least the people she's walking into the Reichstag with there, etc. Huge question, but it does show that at least at that point there was genuine discussion in the Comintern, and there was room for compromise, etc. The third period later on is the idea that's forced through the Comintern leadership and also the German Communist Party leadership, that social democracy, the SPD, has become kind of objectively revolutionary and fascistic. And she describes this as a complete nonsense. And indeed, one of the other tropes that we'll see alongside the focus on education, political enlightenment and organization is Zetkin's understanding of the United Front, of speaking to the masses of social democrats, trying to win them over, arguing with them, etc. That was a constant kind of feature of her career as a politician, and she was not happy with the third period policy that was forced upon the KPD, the ultra leftists within the KPD that kind of forced her out. And indeed, there's an interesting. She was also, by the way, incredibly critical of Teddy Teilman, who was the kind of the German Stalin, as he's known, and he became the presidential candidate in the Weimar Republic at her expense. And there are debates over whether actually Zetkin would have been a better candidate. But again, that's another huge topic. I'm happy to talk about any of these things if you have questions or contributions on them. Stalin and Bukharin I'll come back to. And then we move on to this relationship. Then I'll wrap up in a few minutes, Tina. We've seen that she orientates towards the Communist International, does great work there in many ways, not just as a parliamentarian for the KPD, but in the Communist women's movement. She writes, for example, a book I've got here somewhere, From the Liberated Caucasus, still not in English yet, unfortunately, where she describes the kind of difficulties of working with women coming from very traditional peasant religious backgrounds, with the veil, etc. And she describes the nuances of doing that kind of work. Really, really interesting stuff, which again will hopefully be translated. But there are a few, I say here, a tragedy of her own making. It is clear that Zetkin's allegiance and loyalty to the Russian Revolution also kind of gets her into kind of, it kind of forces her into a corner in some ways, politically and ideologically. It should be said that I'll come back to the old witch kiss Lenin's had. She was very wary of public criticism of the Soviet Union in the 20s, even into the late 20s and early 30s, as kind of undermining that state. And that was very much her approach. But that kind of gets her into a very tricky situation, because on the one hand, she is convinced that lots of things are going wrong, that the peasantry is being forced to do things that it shouldn't be forced into do, for example, that the politics of the Comintern are having all sorts of disastrous effects on the communist parties abroad. Germany, obviously, forefront in her mind at that point. But she also lacks a kind of public channel, certainly in the later days of her life in the early 30s, through which to exercise that criticism, to the point, for example, where when she would give official talks in Moscow, one of the ways she might kind of between the lines express her criticism of Stalin, who I'll talk about in a second, would be, in a speech to quote Marx and Engels 4 times and maybe Lenin twice, but Stalin only once, right? And it's kind of, there's a tragic aspect to that, which obviously goes along with the tragic retreat and defeat of the Russian Revolution. She was in many ways on the so-called right of the communist leadership at that time. She was very close to Nikolai Bukharin. Again, I can go into more details if you like. And it's through Bukharin, well, it's partly through Bukharin and also through Stalin, that we hear of her last meeting with Lenin before Lenin dies in 1924. She was very close with Lenin ever since she'd met him in Stuttgart in her home. Actually, Lenin came to visit her after the Stuttgart Congress in 1907, and very close to him. And she, you would have seen the books she's produced from conversations with Lenin, etc. They're available in English. And at that last meeting, she apparently, before she leaves, she kisses Lenin's hands. I don't know if that's a Russian thing. I don't know, but that's what she does. And Bukharin reports this. And later on, Stalin, in a letter, I can't remember who's writing the letter to, he refers to Zetkin as the old witch, right? The old witch kissed Lenin's hands. He did not have any time for Zetkin, and the feeling was mutual. She was not a fan of Stalin. She did like Bukharin, but she was not a fan of Stalin and his ways and kind of brutishness, etc. And in that, by the way, by referring to her as an old witch, that's he kind of unconsciously echoed the words of Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Bill, as we might know him, who called Zetkin the most dangerous witch of the Kaiserreich, of the German Empire. One other thing to be said, so yes, close to Bukharin, she remained faithful to the Russian Revolution kind of at all costs, but also the idea that socialism could be built and established in one country. So, for example, when it comes to the expulsion of Trotsky and his allies, she basically writes an article in public, it's also available in English, denouncing Trotsky and his comrades, and says that they've, while they're very talented people, they've either acted as traitors or cowards or idiots, I think is the other thing she says as well, kind of in an idiotic fashion. So there's a I would argue a slightly tragic denouement to the way her life ends up. I didn't mention the last speech, the last stand. I should maybe just do that very quickly. The last political act is a very brave one. She receives a letter from the German Communist Party leadership, where she's kind of spending her final days. This is in 1932. She's in just outside Moscow, where she eventually dies. And it turns out that in German parliamentary tradition, it's customary for the oldest member of the House to give the opening speech at the Reichstag. And she writes back to the leadership. She says, "I'll be there dead or alive," basically, right? Because she's her health is failing. She receives all sorts of death threats from what is a fascist-dominated Reichstag at that time. And she gets up basically and calls for the united front of the working masses against the menace of fascism, which is, so for all the tragedy that ends her life, that's actually, I think, quite a kind of moving, stirring final act. And I've translated that speech. You can also get the audio of it online. If you want me to put that in the chat, I can. Just finally, in terms of coming back into focus, here's I tried to do this coming back into focus. You can see Zetkin just make her out there between the other side of Parvus and next to Rosa Luxemburg. You can just see here. One of the real problems, and I'll end with this, is that we still have very much a distorted image of Zetkin for a number of quite concrete historical reasons. I mentioned Stalin and the old witch kissed Lenin's hands, but in public, when it came to Zetkin, her legacy, her work, her ideas, her pamphlets, etc., were instrumentalized. They were kind of almost a mythological founding point of the Stalinist Soviet state and the later German Democratic Republic, where she was on stamps, on posters, on lionized. But basically, what's becoming increasingly clear is that in so doing, her works in Russian, for example, were completely falsified. All sorts of passages struck without comment, changed, etc. We've now, and this is maybe some news that good news to announce to you, we've now actually located a 34-volume collected works in German in the former GDR archive, but they were never produced under the GDR. And some of the stuff that was in her selected speeches and writings, the emphasis being selected, were again, they were excised and cut without commentary, etc. So only now really are we beginning to maybe get a more rounded understanding, approach her work with fresh eyes and compare it against the originals as well to see what had been doctored. Because basically what happened, this lionization of Zetkin as this kind of Stalinist superwoman, that the precondition of that was her nachlass, her papers, her testament was kind of sat on and only kind of drip given out to the masses. And again, this is a state with the GDR, for example. anything that was critical of the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution was seen as risque. So Rosa Luxemburg's pamphlet, that's the Russian Revolution, that she wrote in jail as the Russian Revolution is unfolding, that was only published in 1977 in the GDR. It was not allowed to be published before then. And as I say, Zetkin's works are now, we've kind of located this huge project, which is now going to be opened up and for people like me to work on and make available in English. And so in that sense, my introduction to her life comes with a few caveats. We still, as I say, this is a controversial figure, remains controversial, and in many ways we still are only approaching a full and rounded appreciation of her legacy, let alone in a kind of Marxist dealing with that and editing of that. So I will finish there and look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Wow, Ben, brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, this is a fascinating life, isn't it, in the most interesting period of our working class history in the last few hundred years, for sure. She encapsulates a lot of things that were going on and were going wrong as well. That's really interesting. Comrades, if you have any questions or comments, please click raise hand. I'm going to get the ball rolling a little bit, Ben. I've got a few questions or comments and contributions. I think at the beginning, her political activity around the SPD is fascinating, isn't it? Because it shows how entrenched the social democracy, the German social democracy, was in the working class. I mean, she, as you say, the circulation went up to 124,000 paid copies, presumably, and not just giving away copies. A reflection, of course, how the SPD was entrenched in the working class. And even me growing up in Germany, and the social democracy was quite different then, but there were still clubs, cycle clubs, reading clubs, you go camps for kids and stuff organized by the SPD. And that was, of course, much more radical at the beginning of the 20th century and very very influential in politicizing the whole working class. There were dozens, if not hundreds at some stage, publications, local, regional, for particular sections, for daily, weekly, there are all sorts of publications dealing with all sorts of issues. I'm interested in her role in Parliament, and maybe you could say a bit more about that, because we do have obviously quite a different system in Britain in terms of, the only time we had communist MPs was when they were kind of smuggled in through the Labour Party. But to have a communist MP in Parliament, did she manage to use it as a platform? You mentioned that last speech, for sure. That is in the face of Nazis taking over, etc. That is very courageous. But in terms of using it as a platform, in those 12, 13 years for other issues, we've got the situation now where obviously the electoral system in Britain is coming under more and more scrutiny, with the Labour Party going so far to the right that the left has no political expression anymore at all. And, should the left campaign for a fairer electoral system, like, for example, in Germany, where, although it was different then than it is now, but you still had a kind of electoral system where the left could get into Parliament, and not without piggybacking onto the Social Democrats, but as a left party. Did she make use of it, is one question. And then, but the other thing is of course her relationship with the Stalinist regime, very interesting as well. And I think reflecting a difficulty, to put it mildly, that a lot of socialists, communists around the world would have had. You see this hugely inspiring and liberating act of the Russian Revolution, supported by a majority of the working class, etc. And yet, with Lenin, who said a few weeks before the revolution and over again, unless the Germans make revolution, we're buggered. It's not going to become a communist or even a socialist. It cannot become socialism if it stays in one country. So it must spread. But then faced with this situation that you've made revolution, the Germans, for whatever reasons, can't make revolution, nobody else is making revolution, what do you do in a situation where you've conquered power and you cannot spread it worldwide. And I think she is a really good reflection of that, that really difficult situation. You have to defend it while you also know it's going to shit. So it's very easy, I think, from today's perspective to say, well, the Soviet Union was always shit, it was always crap, and Stalin, Lenin led to Stalin, etc. Well, he did because he did, but it didn't have to be that way. And I think she, when you're there by yourself, in person, having participated in all these struggles and fighting for revolution, it's happening somewhere. That idea that you have to defend it while you're seeing it going to shits is interesting. Though of course she was not without criticism, and perhaps there are far more criticisms yet to be found. That tension is hugely interesting. But you're saying in terms of Trotsky, she basically stabbed him in the back, and there was nothing there. Unless there's something else that we might yet have to see. Okay, so if you maybe could answer the question on the platform issue, and then we can bring
sure. So yeah, I mean, maybe I should start with the your last point about the what do you do and everything. There's, again, I don't want to bore people with kind of the historical documents that get me so excited at the moment, but one of the things that's come out relatively recently is a letter from her one son, Kostya Zetkin, I think in 38, maybe something like that, right? So the Second World War is on the horizon. The fascists have been in power for 5 years. His mum's been dead for 5 years. And there's this kind of break between the two brothers. Maxim, on the one hand, stays in the Soviet Union. He marries a Russian woman who's also important in Zetkin's papers, testament, will, etc. And the other brother decides to emigrate to America. And one of the reasons why is that he thinks that the Soviet Union is engaging in problematic things in concrete relation to his mother. So, for example, when she died, they have these huge papers all go to Moscow, and they had to sign them away as the heirs of Zetkin, but they had to take everything. Like literally, he was saying, why do they have to take my drawings from when I was in Paris and I'm 3 years old? They've literally taken everything. And so he was kind of suspicious of that and how it would be treated. And it came to a kind of disagreement between the two brothers. But even then he's saying, I do not want to say anything in this letter of application that you should translate that will harm the Soviet Union, right? So there's this concrete thing. But I think from a very early age, it became clear that that would be problematic. We don't know that much yet. I said that the Trotsky article, the anti-Trotsky article she wrote, I think in 28, maybe, I can't remember exactly. That is available in English. You can type it in, and it's also in German. Both are online. But yes, what do you do? Where do you go? And I think obviously a lot of papers and letters, correspondence was lost, partly due to the rise of fascism. But there are, this is also a great book, by the way. This is Zetkin Die Kriegsbriefe, and so this was 2016. So this is all her correspondence from during the war, which is taken from the now accessible archive. And instead of being in her really difficult handwriting, it's obviously typed up and everything. So that's going to be an ongoing project to get all of her letters through to her death, insofar as we can find them, right? On the platform thing, so yeah, I mean, there were the Communist Party parliamentary faction were quite successful in a number of ways, despite the kind of madness that was going on in the party and this kind of instrumentalized factionalism. They did some really good work, and from all sorts of things to a referendum on whether to enteignen, what's that, to expropriate the rich, right? Things like that, but also crucially as well in the early 20s, critiquing the German orientation towards Russia, the kind of militarization, Germany becoming a kind of force against Russia, hands-off Russia campaign. They used that in Parliament very well. Questions of abortion. Some comrades of mine are working on this at the moment. The question of abortion in the Weimar Republic becomes key. The infamous paragraph working with the SPD in certain questions insofar as that was possible, etc. So yeah, she's an energetic. She uses her platform energetically on a whole number of questions. but we should also remember that she's only part of the fraction. There are other people involved as well, and really, in the 20s, her health is such that she is going back and forth she spends a lot of her time in Moscow, partly because of her duties in the Comintern, right? So she has to weigh it up against, is it worth me being in my while in Berlin now, or should I be working in the Comintern or in the Communist International Women's Movement? And that's always an issue for a parliamentarian. Sometimes it is just it's a waste of political time to be in parliament. But no, of course, she used it as a tribune, and she was used to that. She was also a USPD independent social democrat representative for the state of Württemberg in Stuttgart. So she would also do that and use her tribune to support, the German Revolution, the council movement, help prisoners, whatever. At a time, of course, which was really quite troubling for her, because pretty much all of her best friends are killed within the space of 2 or 3 months, right? So Luxembourg, Liebknecht, Jöggesche, Mehring dies, and in a sense she's on her own, and they're tough times. But the kind of connection to Moscow and the Communist International Movement helps that for sure. But yeah, I think there's a lot of good stuff there. One of the things that was actually falsified by the GDR what came in a parliamentary speech on Russia, actually, where she was slightly critical of some of the Bolshevik policies and talked of fraternal war between the socialist parties, which was perhaps unnecessary. So she's talking about the Mensheviks and the SRs, etc. And fraternal war was turned into civil war by the editors of which is a bit, as you speak German, it's a bit of a leap of it's not just a typo, is it? There's a lot of letters being changed there. So yeah, a great parliamentarian, and some of her speeches are available in English. And the fascism, I think, as I say, the opening speech as the oldest member of parliament really is a fitting kind of icing on the cake to that, the merits of that parliamentary activity in the face of a parliament that was basically 40% fascist, maybe more. I don't have the numbers to hand. I think that's everything, right? Oh, sorry, just on embeddedness and publications. The SPD had 96 daily newspapers, right? And again, that reflects kind of German local traditions of even today you have very strong regionally focused newspapers, right? But the left kind of fed into that at the time as well. And it should be said that the 124,000 figure, it's difficult to say what I think those are based on subscription. So there would be, especially in the early days, it would be given through several hands as well, because people were poor, right? So they would go through several hands. But one of the things to note as well is that the SPD leadership was so kind of intimidated or upset by this publication that in 1914, and this is why the numbers start to sink, they launched a desubscription campaign. So they use their influence in the union. So each union branch pretty much would have a subscription, right? Because it would land in they cancelled all that. They put pressure on members to cancel it. So yeah, this publication that I'm working on really is a fascinating kind of snapshot of those fateful 25 years of revolutionary social democracy.
Yes, thank you very much, Ben. Also important, as you mentioned, to remember that it was Clara Zetkin who was the leading light in fighting for the International Workers' Women's Day, which exactly. If you look at today at International Women's Day, the way it's been incorporated is a shame, a shambles, and an outrage if we consider where it's come from the communist movement. Okay, thank you very much, Ben. We have somebody wants to come in. I can't see your name. Maybe you could introduce yourself. Hi. Can you ask a question or make a comment?
Hi, Tina. Is it me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear and see you. Hi. Yeah.
Okay, good. Glyn Beagley.
Glyn, hi.
Isn't it? Right. Hi. Nice to see you again. About 5 years ago, I managed to get hold of a copy of a book by Clara Zetkin in the British Library, which was called Women and Socialism. I don't know if Ben's aware of that publication. He probably is. But when I got the invitation email through today earlier on, I saw this. I thought, right, I'll make sure I get along to this because it's going to be quite interesting. Now, my particular interest in the last year or so has been following up on the work of Engels in the SPD. And of course, Engels wrote Origins of the Family, State and Private Property. Much of that was based on notebooks, 194 pages of notebooks, which he inherited from Marx, because Marx based his work on Lewis Henry Morgan. At least if you go through all 5 copies of Engels' Origins in the British Library, it's clear that Marx wrote up a considerable amount of material which he passed on to Engels. Marx died and Engels wrote up his book on Origins of the Family, State and Private Property. I'm just interested, Ben, if there's any overlap between the work that Engels put in on this subject. When he was, as I understand it, Engels was active in the SPD, am I right, in 1880s up until his death. I'm particularly interested if there's any overlap between the work of Engels, particularly in relation, but not exclusively in relation to the family, also more broadly on the question of women and women's position in German society. What was the relationship between Zetkin and Engels? Indeed, was there any interest that Zetkin had? And what was Engels doing on these subjects? Were they working together? Were they like-minded? Were they perhaps in conflict with one another? And I must say, I'd recommend comrades to get hold of that book, Women and Socialism by Zetkin. It was first published in English, I think 1928 was the edition I got hold of. I don't know, Ben, if you're aware of that, but if you could just generally comment and lead us into that kind of that work that was going on.
Thank you, comrade. Ben, do you want to answer straight away? I think
that'll probably be best. Yeah.
Oh,
sorry, no, I pressed by accident. Sorry, I'm unaware of anything. Thanks for that, Glenn. I'm unaware of a book by Zetkin called Women and Socialism. Women and Socialism is Bebel's text, August Bebel's text. That was the foundational text that basically, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the best-selling book of German socialism. It went through something like 16 editions. It was really the and it's obviously in English. It was one famously translated as, or mistranslated as, women under socialism, because und der comes together. But again, that's a joke if you know a bit of German. It was mistranslated as women under socialism. Hal Draper makes a lot of fun about its mistranslation, but that was Bebel's book, and indeed that was instrumental to Zetkin's political development, right? Because as I mentioned, in Switzerland, she would, in particular, she met Bebel before this birthday party meeting that I mentioned, where her husband or her life partner Zetkin got arrested. So she knew Bebel from before. She already read his speeches, and she read that book and thoroughly enjoyed it. And she produced her own. I'm producing this as a pamphlet. It'll be out probably at the end of this month, maybe next month. It's called the Women and Working Women's Question of Our Time. It was Zetkin's first pamphlet that she ever produced. It's about 50 pages. I've just translated that, and it leans heavily on some of Bebel's arguments. And indeed, at one of the SPD party congresses, I forget which one now, Bebel actually heckles her because she's been quite self-critical about this pamphlet, and he says, "Oh, it wasn't that bad," from the floor. Right? But yeah, Bebel's book, Women and Socialism, was a huge success and definitely worth reading. One of the things, so you took the role of Engels. One of the things that happens with that book, as I say, it goes through numerous editions, and in a sense, Bebel expands it. I'm not an expert on the book, but I know from reading around it that Bebel expands that book and fills it out in response to Engels's Private Property book, right? So that comes later, and then he's working on that and expands it to incorporate some of Engels's arguments. And a number of further points to be made here on Engels. Engels's contribution to the SPD on matriarchy, using the notebooks, as you rightly point out, is really, again, just the kind of is scraping the top of this rich discussion of the family in the SPD. For example, I have been working on something by an SPD theoretician and scholar called Heinrich Kuno, who became a right-winger eventually in 1914. He writes a critique of Engels in the pages of Die Neue Zeit, I think in 1903 I can't remember exactly when it was, but that was Kautsky's theoretical journal. So there's huge discussions based off this anthropological data that they're all using because it was so revolutionary at the time. Marx and Engels weren't the only people to use that to discuss, to make their points. And if you read Rosa Luxemburg, her recent works in English, she writes a lot about ancient societies, about clans, so-called primitive societies, matriarchy, etc., etc. So it was part of a broader discussion within the SPD. I will say, and maybe this reflects Zetkin's position, I would say she was a theoretician. She added unique things to the Marxist arsenal, I would argue, not least the proletarian women's movement and and that question of how to organize men and women. I think that was a unique contribution. But I wouldn't say, from what I've read so far, and I've read a lot of Zetkin, I haven't really seen her explicitly take up these arguments in greater detail about matriarchy. So in the pamphlet that I mentioned that I'll be producing in the next couple of weeks, she talks about matriarchy as the kind of basis, and then she talks about the emergence of the warrior caste and how that undoes it all, but she doesn't really dwell on the matriarchy question in any detail. So I would argue that it's more the classic theorists of the party that do that: Kautsky, Kuno, Luxemburg, and obviously Engels, who intervenes. And you're quite right to say that Engels, even though he's living in London, he devotes a lot of his time and attention to the SPD because he saw it quite rightly. And this is where I think the left is completely wrong to dismiss the SPD as this kind of crypto reformist Labour Party type organization. He devoted a lot of his time in the later years to political disputes within the party, to arranging the Second International, etc., and to intervening. And when it comes to the relationship between Zetkin and Engels, was there an overlap? Yes, there was. One of the things that we found now in Zetkin's correspondence, which I will be translating, is a previously unpublished letter. It was unpublished in German. It certainly hasn't been published in English yet. From Zetkin to Engels, a long letter on sex in the sense of biological sex and love. And it's a long, maybe 10 pages, and she goes into some and asks him lots of questions about these things and what he thinks. And I remember, you may have seen the very famous picture of the which Congress is it? It's one of the Second International Congresses. I can't remember which one. It's in the 1890s. There's an old Engels, and he's sat next to Clara Zetkin, and he says, Zetkin is an incredibly talented woman. She is a bit overexcitable, but he certainly had a high opinion of her. And yes, his work would have deeply influenced her, but not in the sense that she then developed a kind of rejoined or built upon it. I think that was the preserve of other people. I think that hopefully that answers your questions.
Yeah. Okay. I'll put something. I'm just going to put something in chat, but that's great. Okay, thanks very much.
Steve.
Hi, Ben. Absolutely great talk, really, and built on impressive knowledge. I mean, it's really good. I really enjoyed it. So great. I want to ask you a question, but then just elaborate a little bit on the question before you have to answer it. But what I was wondering, and it came out of listening to what you had to say, was, can you tell me, or do you know what the program of the German Communist Party was in round about 1930, 1932? Now, what prompted me to ask this was when you said that Clara Zetkin was in the Reichstag, I think in 1932, and made a brave or heroic speech. Obviously a very unpleasant, hostile environment. I'm absolutely sure of that. So, so what I was thinking as I thought about this was, I wanted to just go back to the Weimar Republic, and just to think about that for a minute, because obviously the Weimar Republic was on one hand a sort of democratic step forward in the sense that it overthrew the Kaiser Reich. But on the other hand, it was counter-revolution because there was a crushing of the working class and there was a stabilization. There was an establishment of a kind of bureaucratic republic, I suppose you might say, with a president, almost a monarchical republic in which the president, Hindenburg at this time, was to have these monarchical powers, very powerful executive powers, like a Kaiser state without the Kaiser, a Kaiser republic without a Kaiser in it. And Hindenburg, we know, played a very disastrous role in Hitler's rise to power because he was able to use his executive powers against the working class and ease Hitler's leg up into power. So the Weimar Republic was obviously therefore a great problematic thing. Now, if you go back to 1928 and 29, and Hitler was obviously very strongly opposed to the Weimar Republic. I'm sure that was a fundamental part of his agitation. The traitors of Weimar had sold out the German people, blah, blah, blah. So I'm wondering to myself, at this time when you have, with the crisis of capitalism in 1928-29, you've also got this real crisis of democracy. That is to say, the crisis of the German Weimar Republic. And the question is, Hitler's going to replace the Weimar Republic with fascism. And what was the Communist Party doing, posing the alternative? Was the Communist Party simply going all part of the Soviets, which is a kind of ultra-left? It would be a continuation of the ultra-left third period type approach, I think, that you also spoke about, that you simply pose Soviets to the Weimar Republic, or would you have, or would it be correct to put forward a different kind of, a much more democratic republic against Hitler, and argue that actually the Weimar Republic should be gotten rid of and a new more democratic republic should have been created? So I might go back to my original question was this: what kind of program did the German Communist Party try to fight Hitler with in 1930-31, that obviously Clara Zetkin was playing a very important role in that resistance to fascism? That's it.
Want to answer, Ben?
Sure, yeah, as best I can. I mean, I haven't looked at this at the early 30s, late 20s for a while, but obviously, you know yourself, Steve, that against the KPD at this time is a very unstable formation. So there's basically this kind of constant lurching between the left and the right that's fed by factional intrigues from Moscow, and the party becomes a kind of plaything for the struggles that are going on in Moscow themselves, right? So there's this kind of flip-flopping, and I always thought to myself, okay, when I first translated that speech in 1932, I'm looking, okay, where are the signs potentially of third periodism? You don't see them. Where are maybe the signs of more, a kind of popular frontist later approach, where we get all democratic forces together to of all classes to oppose. That's not there either. So I think it's very tricky as a historian going back and looking at Zetkin as her, to what extent is she bowing to what's being said? And a speech would have been read by the leaders, the KPD leaders before she gave it, etc. To what extent is it a reflection of her politics, her own politics, and a reflection of that of the KPD at the time? And that's tricky to say, right? Because as I alluded to, she has been ousted really of the KPD leadership at this time. What's happened is that Teomann's come in, and she is away largely in Moscow. She's, I think she's not even on the leadership anymore at that point, I think. And so basically she's in a strange position. It's only the fact that she's so old, as it were, right, that propels her into this position of a real public strong voice for the KPD. And I would have a look at, maybe you'll find something in the speech that I don't, but when I translated it, it seemed to me, United Front, of as she says, of all working people, and she has a thing as well about we need to win over the intellectuals and the artists. It's again reflects her milieu. I should have said she married an artist, Friedrich Sunder, later on. It was her second husband. So that was interesting to me. I didn't see the kind of fingerprints, if you like, of the Moscow and the factional struggles. As to the program of the KPD and Weimar, you're right that I think it's a good description of, it was Engels, wasn't it, about the Third Republic, the empire without the emperor. I think that's a fairly good summary of the Weimar Republic as well. And even in the very early days when they're working out the constitution, there's this huge hoo-ha of those involved between, should we use the word Reich or should we use the word Republik, right? And they actually mix them up at times as well, right? Because but strangely enough, again, I don't want to take too much of a side, Weimar Republic is actually a swear word that we've inherited subsequently. Because actually it wasn't a republic. It was actually the way in which the Hitlerites referred to the dirty Weimar Republic, and we just kind of taken it as our kind of common kind of reference. But that's largely how that term was used. So when it comes to Zetkin, what the speech in 32, she says, "I look forward one day to welcoming the German Soviet Republic, right? That's how she phrases it. And you know, I've written quite a lot more on the early program of the KPD, where I think, yes, there's evidence of ultra leftism, in the sense that there's no clear program for fundamentally overhauling the existing structures of the Weimar Republic, which were, as you say, authoritarian, heavily weighted towards the executive, presidential vetoes and decrees. So there's certain articles that could be deployed by the president and were deployed for quite fateful ends. All of that, and I would say that actually it reflects a weakness actually in Zetkin's closest ally, Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote the program of the KPD in 1918-1919, which was to say that the age of the minimum program is over. It's all about the socialist revolution now, and I think that fed in. I can't tell you, you know, this X 0.4, 0.6 in 1930-32, but I know that would have been a tradition that played on throughout it. And as I say, it's complex because it's overlaid by this left and right shift within the KPD. But broadly speaking, yes, I would make similar criticisms of the KPD's program and outlook as you just have. I think
that makes complete sense to me, Ben. That's all I can say.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, Ken, please.
Well, thank you very much for that talk. You mentioned that Clara spent a period of time in Moscow. Now, I'm curious as to how much of her life she spent in Moscow and what reception she received. Was she even under surveillance? Was she seen as an ally? And going back to the specific issue of Trotsky, did she ever meet Trotsky or debate with him? And if not, what actually colored her attitude to him as it was reflected in the article you mentioned? So, thank you.
Shall I respond to that?
Thanks. Yes, please, Ben.
Yeah. So again, this is a question that I can't give kind of concrete evidence for, but certainly she would have met Trotsky. I mean, she was on the ECCI, the executive of Comintern. She was at all of the congresses. I think from the third Congress she was there. So she would have met Trotsky on various occasions, and I don't know, I don't know enough about, again, because we're just starting to kind of open up the correspondence and see what's going on. I don't know exactly what's kind of soured her view of Trotsky and what played into that. I do think that if you think about the factional struggles, of which I'm not an expert, but if you think about the factional struggles, we have to perhaps understand how important it would be for the opponents of Trotsky to get the kind of imprimatur of Zetkin. She is one of the most, she is one of the most famous people in the international workers movement. We have to get that clear in our heads. She's up there with the greats. Her name is spoken on the streets of Moscow. There's the opening congress of the Communist Women's Movement. There's a speech. We follow in the footsteps of our one magnificent leader, Clara Zetkin. There's thousands of people on a demonstration. You get the image, right? So there's a positive impulse to recognize her great contribution, enduring contribution. She is one of the few people with a social base, as I said, through this newspaper, that goes from revolutionary social democracy in a position of leadership into the Third International. So in that sense, she's an important coup for the Third International in its early days, right? And indeed, she goes to tour in France because she speaks French, and she travels there illegally in a wig, dressed as an actress. Is a very famous picture of her, and she appears out of nowhere and gives this big speech about why the French Socialist Party must split in favor of Moscow, and et cetera, et cetera. So she was a very important figure. But the question is then, and I have no fixed solution to or answer to this, because it's something I'm working on and discovering more stuff. But at some point, that kind of celebrity figure that she is given and embraces, etc., becomes a kind of hindrance, or actually limits her as a political figure. Does that make sense? So that in a sense, she's kind of instrumentalized and used and abused even when she's alive. Does that make sense? So she's got this fame, she's got this renown, And I think that, you know, for very complicated reasons, that she's then dropped. And I think that Trotsky article maybe I would insinuate an example of adding authority to a particular factional struggle at a particular time, because she did have a huge following. And you know, you can just see that when she goes around the Caucasus, example, she is a celebrity figure. I had some pictures at the start of her with these women in the Caucasus, etc. And yeah, she was a cause celeb of the communist movement in the best sense, and then later in the worst sense, in the way her legacy was instrumentalized and falsified and censored, etc., etc. So yes, a hugely important figure. On the Trotsky thing, I have to pass, because I don't know, but I know that, if you know, she was very close to Bukharin. She liked Bukharin. She respected his judgment. I think partly because Bukharin, in defense of Bukharin, spoke a lot of sense when it came to Germany, particularly on the third period question, etc. I think, and she respected that. But as to the you know, a more conclusive answer, I have to wait until I've dug through some of these papers in the Zampo in Berlin, which is ongoing, and other people, German historians, working on a correspondence. So yeah, I don't know the exact ins and outs, but I'm sure there'll be great material. I should also say, by the way, there's a video again, because I'm using a different computer. Maybe, Tina, I can put like a list of links up on the website or something for those to be interested. But there's actual archival footage of her funeral in Moscow that's available on a Russian website. And again, it reminds me a little bit about the Lenin situation. It's all about the symbolism. So you have Stalin and Molotov at the front carrying, and I say Stalin hated her, she hated him. Everyone kind of knew that, right? But just the thousands upon thousands of people that are there at a funeral is striking, you know. And there was not recently, it's a long time ago, there was, in the British Museum, there was an exhibition on early Soviet society, images from early, it was David King's exhibition. I don't know if you saw that one, a leftist photographer, and he collected all these images, and again, video footage of her actually alongside people like Trotsky and Zinoviev from earlier times, you know, in say around the Third Congress, etc. And she did spend a lot of her time in Russia, partly because of her health. So she had family there. She had a little flat in Berlin that she would use to go and do her Reichstag duties. But I think at some point she realized, okay, more important, especially when she's kicked out of the KPD and KPD leadership and kind of pushed aside, she focuses her attention more on her work in Moscow, work in the international, the work in the women's international, etc. But so she did spend, you know, 6-8 months at a time in just outside, I can't remember the name of the place, Arkhangel or something, just outside Moscow, where she eventually dies.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ben, I've got one more question, and perhaps in answering that, you could also then sum up, because we haven't got any more questions. Which is, I mean, she was obviously around during the attempt of the German Revolution, which was so crucial in, you know, the understanding as well of Lenin as the position of the Russian Revolution. And yet there was quite a lot of disagreement between Luxemburg and Liebknecht when it comes to the revolution. And, you know, the Liebknecht kept pushing and and Luxemburg tried to hold him back, etc. So what was her position there? Where was she more, on whose side was she more? And you know, how did she view the problems that the German working class faced? There wasn't really an active majority there to prepared to make revolution at that time.
Yeah, so this is something I've written on in the past as well. I think in terms of her general reading of the situation, there's this really kind of tragic letter that's one of the last letters that I think it's even the last letter she writes to Rosa Luxemburg before she's killed. And she says something like, Rosa, you know that I can't always trust my own political judgment. I need to get to Berlin and speak with you and work with you, etc. But there's two problems. The first is that she's very ill. She's not particularly mobile at the time. But although she's like firing off letters and articles, and she's speaking at local Stuttgart things, etc. And the other problem is security, safety, because they're not quite sure. Can you even travel at this point? Are you going to get there? What's going on? And you know, and that's one of the last letters I think that she writes to Rosa Luxemburg, and it's found later. It's a really kind of harrowing story. and she never gets the response to that. So she wasn't the leading strategist in the KPD, I would say. She was really but I wouldn't want to dismiss her either as kind of like a middling, you know what I mean? She was somebody who was a theoretical brain, wrote an enormous amount of work, 34 volumes, you know, hopefully in collected works. But what was significant about her role in the Spartacus League was that she had a real following. Liebknecht and Luxemburg and others, they were respected intellectuals. People knew their names and, you know, and their bravery. They'd been in and out of jail, as had Zetkin, and, you know, that had a following. But Zetkin had a real base through the Gleichheit and through the international women's movement. So when it came to the judgment of the January, the so-called Spartacus uprising, that wasn't the Spartacus uprising because actually it was never agreed by the Spartacus leadership. It was actually a meeting of the shop stewards, and Liebknecht was there and they went along with it. And then Luxemburg famously says, "Is that our program car?" Blah, blah, blah. Her position on that would have been certainly close to Rosa Luxemburg's, even though that's not expressed in articles at the time. You know, that's absolutely clear. And generally speaking, this is why a great strength of Clara Zetkin's, precisely because of her proximity to the masses, a closer proximity. She was always very wary of minority actions and interventions, right? So she throughout her whole life, she would even in response to the declaration that was written by Zetkin and Liebknecht, Luxemburg and Liebknecht after the outbreak of World War I, she was saying we have to be careful. If we put out an action and there's 3 names on it, we'll just appear as stupid. We need to be able to rally bigger forces. And so she was very wary, for example, of the foundation of the German Communist Party, because she said, and I think she was right, that we really needed more time in the USPD to speak to its people, to produce our own publications, our own leaflets, which is incredibly difficult under censorship and conditions of the war. We need more time to mature and then, you know, and then break. And that's actually what happened. The KPD was formed as a tiny group in January 1919, but only becomes a mass force, as I outlined in my book, in October 1920, when the USPD left splits en masse, right, and joins the KPD to become the United Communist Party. So she was very critical of that, and always wanted to that proximity to the masses, and that also informs her, as I alluded to, but couldn't go into more detail, her critique of the March action in 1921, and her critique of the politics of third periodism, this kind of posturing aside from the masses of where they're at. And so in that sense, she was, I think, she's quite rightly seen as a, I have issues with the way the United Front is dealt with on the left today, etc. But she's quite rightly seen as one of the initiators of the United Front policy of the Comintern at its 3rd Congress. And indeed, when it comes to fascism, if you read, again, this is in English, I think we translated it in the Revolutionary History book, there's a long speech by her on Italian fascism and why it represents a special form of reaction, not just some kind of, usual right-wing party. And what she stresses there is that we need the working class to act as a whole. We need to speak to the SPD. We need to get them on board as much as we can, and if we can't, we expose their leaders, etc. So I would argue that's one of the strengths of Zetkin's approach, and it's a fairly constant one through her life. She was seen as a rightist later on in these disputes, but she was always certainly critical of the ultra leftism, and I think to her great credit.
What do you think then, sort of to sum up, what's the main thing perhaps we can learn from her, if that's not, simplifying it a bit?
It's a very difficult question, because this woman was a remarkable individual, right? She did all sorts of things. I've scraped the surface of the things that she achieved, that she managed. I haven't really even begun to talk about her emphasis on socialist education, the role of organizing youth, the role of the party in educating. There are a whole lot of things. I think the enduring, as I say, the one of the major theoretical contributions she makes to the history of the workers' movement, in my opinion, building on Engels, Babel, and others, is that essentially it's imperative that the party, that the Social Democratic Party, the Marxist Party, looks to organize men and women, and that yes, you need special publications, committees, organizing modes, bodies, etc., to address women as women. But that doesn't preclude, she says this even in the Comintern, so that doesn't preclude men being involved. right? It's actually something for the party as a whole to take seriously. And in that sense, you know, the bravery of her, not just in kind of blazing that theoretical trail and fighting for it against opponents in her own party and the bourgeois feminists of the time who, you know, would dismiss her as dogmatic and whatever, but also upholding that position within the party itself in the face of much criticism from male comrades, so-called, right? So I think that's the big theoretical and organizational contribution that I think is an enduring one, an important one. But I would end with the caveat again that really we are dealing, we still don't have a rounded full image of Zetkin. There's very little written. There's no real biography of her in English, and even the stuff in German and French is not really from a Marxist point of view, I would argue. So there's lots that's been missed. But I say only now really do we, and it's an exciting time to be researching her in that sense, because there is a lot of material coming through that we can draw upon and learn. And so I need to get to work.
Like you, I'm fascinated by her approach to children and politicizing
exactly.
children, which is good. I did look at you posted a previously translated what was in those supplements, and it is crikey. I'm not sure how many children actually went through that, because it is.
But it reflects this ambition, doesn't it? You know, the idea that, you know, we must inherit the earth. We actually need a completely different. And again, that's, I think, the enduring influence of her father, Protestant hard work and education, all the rest of it. And but again, that's a whole chapter which nobody's really worked on, and I think it's important to look at that critically, of course, because she's also working in a time. But
and a reflection, of course, of how kids were probably also involved in the social democratic movement much more than, you know, party politics is sort of on the side. It was the whole family, the whole, you know, you would do things with the SPD and stuff. That's fascinating.
Sorry to heckle in, just for example on that, I forgot to mention it because there's so much stuff, but the party would organize summer school, you know, as kids are off school, they would organize summer schools, big hikes. You know, there's the example of sports competitions where the local confectionery cooperative would offer chocolates and things like that. You know, so it's that ambition, which, you know, that's obviously not hers alone. It's part of this, you know, this movement, etc. But there's so much there, and again, I could talk for hours, so I'll stop now. Stop heckling you.
As we're in the last week of school holidays, Jesus, I would have loved to send my daughter to a communist education camp for the last 6 weeks rather than, you know, entertaining her around here. Comrades, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ben, very much. It was absolutely brilliant. This will get lots of views online. No doubt we'll be spreading it. That was fascinating. See you next week, comrades, for Mark Wadsworth, who's introducing Comrade Sack, first communist black British Indian MP who was elected to Parliament exactly 100 years ago. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.